So welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us today. We know your time is valuable, and we thank you for choosing to spend the next hour with us as we explore the link between forced migration and human trafficking and look at legislation currently before Congress that will help to break that link. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all who registered for today's event. I'm Ann Schultz, a school sister of Notre Dame, and your moderator for this discussion. Just last week, we celebrated the feast of St. Josephine Bakhita, patron of those who have been enslaved and all who strive to end human trafficking. So before we begin, let's ask her intercession on our behalf, as together we pray. Creator of us all, we ask your blessing on our time together. Open our hearts to those too often ignored, those forced to flee their homes, those abused and broken, those caught in modern-day slavery. Give us the strength to stand in solidarity with your children made vulnerable to human trafficking, and give us the courage to raise our voices in support of policy and legislation that will help to ensure the safety, dignity, and freedom of all your people. Amen. So a big thank you to our sponsors, two faith-filled organizations with long histories of working to end human trafficking. The Alliance to End Human Trafficking, formerly known as the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, and the National Advocacy Center of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. Thank you both for making these efforts possible. Now, as many of you know, women religious and their allies are longtime leaders in the efforts to put an end to the exploitation of others. Together, they have educated the public about the dangers of human trafficking and accompanied survivors on their journey to healing, even as they've worked to address the root causes of human trafficking, including forced migration. Catholic sisters and their colleagues have seen firsthand how human traffickers prey on those forced to flee their homes by circumstances beyond their control. And they've come to understand the vulnerabilities created by sometimes ineffective US policy. We know that hundreds of millions of our sisters and brothers have been forced from their homes by floods and famines, war and gang violence, endemic poverty, and political corruption. We know that migrants, including migrant children, are sold for sex and labor and exploited across a range of industries, even in our own country. In fact, the US Department of State estimates that 72% of persons trafficked in the United States each year are immigrants. Today, we'll examine that dangerous link between forced migration and human trafficking. And we'll take a look at some legislation currently before Congress that can address some of those factors that make people on the move particularly vulnerable to human trafficking. So as we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our three panelists who will guide our exploration today. Each is very well acquainted with this reality. It's their experience and their observations that will inform our conversation today, and it will inform our work going forward. First, Kwami Adoboe-Herrera is an advocate, consultant, speaker, and educator for anti-trafficking initiatives, and a survivor of international and domestic labor trafficking. He is a presidential appointee to the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking of the U.S. Department of State, and he also serves on the Survivor Advisory Board of the Alliance. Our second speaker is a sister of St. Francis of Philadelphia and a member of their Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Committee. Sister Maria Orlandini currently serves as the Director of Advocacy for the Franciscan Action Network in Washington, D.C., where her advocacy portfolio includes both immigration and human trafficking. Maria's experience of walking with people of Central America makes her advocacy efforts both personal and effective. And as you may recall, Mary Vigil, Staff Director of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, had planned to join us to discuss the legislation currently before the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, Mary is unable to be with us. However, in her stead, we're very fortunate to be able to welcome an experienced legislative advocate who is very familiar with the legislation, Marilyn Zygmunt-Luke. Marilyn is the Director of Advocacy for the Alliance to End Human Trafficking, where she leads and coordinates the organization's public policy and legislative advocacy activities. She's worked in all levels of government, federal, state, and local, and has over 25 years of professional experience with both public and private sector organizations. Marilyn is an attorney licensed to practice in the District of Columbia and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Kwami, Maria, Marilyn, you are all most welcome. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all for all that you do to serve God's people and to put an end to the abuse of their dignity. So, my friends, we'll hear from each of our speakers in turn. Then we'll welcome the executive directors of our sponsoring organizations, who will talk about how we can join their effort to affect public policy. And we promise to leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. As we proceed, we invite you to write any questions or comments you have in the Q&A box, which you can access on the lower toolbar of Zoom. So let's begin with Kwami. Kwami, I understand you were brought to the United States from your home in Togo as a young boy and forced into labor trafficking. Can you tell us a bit about your experience of this dangerous link between migration and human trafficking? And maybe a little bit about what the conditions in Togo were like that led your parents to allow you to leave home at such a young age. Kwami?
Thank you very much for that beautiful question. Again, thank you for having me and giving me the spotlight to express my my thought on this movement and what we can do to even, eradicate this evil in our country and around the world. With that question being asked, just wanted to start with saying that, I got to where I'm here today because of, the grace of God. I didn't do it on my own. I just happened to be it's a tragic and an unfortunate event that I found myself in. And so, yeah, I'm just blessed to be where I am today. With that being said, back in 2006, I was brought into this country from Togo, a very small country located on the west coast of Africa. I'm one of the 7 kids in my family. Growing up, I longed to go to school. I longed to educate and to learn and be a person of that can provide for my family. My parents they grew up, didn't go to school, and so something that they want me to have, they want me to be better than them. So they long for that. And we are farmers, we are poor. And so the opportunity presents itself. And so what happened is that a friend of my family member, he lives here in the US during that time, and he saw an opportunity to bring me here. He promised my parents that he will provide me education, something that my parents want for me, something that I want. And I was only 7, I just want to go to school. I want to make my parents proud, and make myself proud as well. As being the oldest, I have a lot of responsibility now I have to take care of, so did I know what was going to happen to me when I come here? No. Did my parents know? No, they didn't either. And it was just an opportunity to present itself. Somebody said, hey, you're a family member, hey, I live here in the US and life is better here. You can go to school and then make it, go to, get a great education and then come home and provide for your family. So parents said, yeah. So I came here in 2006. under this presumption that I'll go to school and live a good life. But as we know, that was not the case for me. 2006, from 2006 until 2023, 2013, my life was a living hell. I found myself with this man, physical abuse, mental abuse, spiritual abuse, you name it all. And on top of that, I was trafficked. No, I do a domestic labor for him. Um, Even before that, he also falsified all my documents. It was more of a, not only did he traffic me, he also smuggled me to this country, meaning he changed my identity. Everything about me was changed. He turned my life the way the way I was made, the way I grew up with my parents, everything about me was become falsified. In order for me to enter the US, everything changed. Again, my parents didn't know this. I didn't know this. I can read. My parents can read. So how would they know? No, I'm sure some of you thinking, oh, did your parents really read? No, they didn't know. This man lives in the US. He speaks English. He knows my language. And so he manipulated the system to bring me here, to smuggle me into this country, knowing what he is going to do. I didn't, and my parents didn't. All we know is that I'm coming here to go to school. And that was the promise that he made to my parents. In turn, was the forced labor. He forced his will on me, brought me here without me knowing what exactly all entailed. Lied to my parents. And for the next 6 years of my life in the US was a living hell. Not only was I was he because he knows the system so well, he also put me to school. Every every waking day was controlled by this man. The moment I go to school, the moment I lay my head back on the bed, he is there. He checks on me 24/7 every single hour. And again, this was happening here in the US, happened in Michigan. That's where I resigned in. Happened in Michigan for 6 years of my life. I was traumatized. I was beaten. I was abused. I was working. I never see the daylight of the profits I was making for him. He controlled every aspect of my life. That's is how I got into this movement. Thank to God, somebody saw saw me in the school system and said, "This child needs help. Let me help you." And that's all it takes. And she did everything she can in her power, even though my trafficker threatened her life. She did it all. And she fight for me so that I can have a good life. And so in turn, I joined this movement to give back to those who are in need of my help. So that's
Kwame, say a little bit more about how we might be able to recognize those signs that that teacher saw in you.
absolutely. As a child, not knowing how to speak English in this country, and first of all, I go to school with so much baggage. I was a trouble kid. Um, I was acting out. I didn't have any friends. I sit in the back of the classroom. Kids go to recess. I'm still in the classroom. I'm wearing a jacket in the middle of the summer. I have bruises on my arm. I don't show sign of, I'm just withdrawn from the class, withdrawn. I do not interact with anybody during this time I was being trafficked. But because this teacher saw something in me, she she started to build a report on me the day one that I walked into that classroom. Without me knowing she was doing this, she was making a report of me. Slowly and slowly, she started to reach out to me. Again, I have built a wall of distrust where I don't want to trust it because my trafficker has brainwashed me to the point where I'm not allowed to believe anything that is happening. I'm not allowed to trust the teachers, the authorities, anybody but him. He's the only person I'm allowed to talk to. So every time my teacher trying to approach me, I shut her down. But she never gives up on me. And that's is something I'm so grateful for. that she never gives up on me. And she kept trying. She was her pursuit of trying to get to me, trying to get into my life was so profound that eventually I broke down in front of her one day and just cried and let it all out, said, this is what's happening to me like this and with my trafficker.
So she was sensitive to you. She was sensitive to your needs.
Yes.
Kept her eyes open.
She did.
So we have to say thank you to her, but even a deeper thank you to you, because your life has become a testament to your strength, and your commitment to ending human trafficking and to supporting other survivors is a gift that you've given. So we thank you. Thank you for sharing your story with us this morning, and thank you even more for sharing your life with so many people who are in need. Thank you, Kwami.
Thank you.
Maria, I think you too have a story to tell. I know that over the course of the past few years, you've spent time in Honduras and in El Salvador, accompanying the people and examining the root causes of forced migration. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you've seen, tell us about what you've learned from the people you've met and accompanied. What are those forces, those things that are really forcing so many to risk the dangerous journey that too often ends in human trafficking? Maria?
Good morning. Thank you, Anne. Thank you. And thank you for asking me to share what my experiences have been in Honduras and El Salvador, two countries that I do love and share in my heart. Since 2010, I went to Honduras 3 times and 3 to El Salvador. All delegations were organized and sponsored by SHARE Foundation, an international nonprofit solidarity organization with a mission to strengthen solidarity with and among the Salvadoran and Honduran people. The delegations had different themes and focuses, but one only purpose: to be in solidarity with the people. I could talk for hours about these trips, the natural beauty of these countries, and the warmth and welcome of their people, but it is not the purpose of my time here today. Maybe the next time. What did I see? And as you asked me, what did I see, experience, and learn in these countries? Well, for reasons of time, I will focus mostly on Honduras, but the conditions are similar in El Salvador. It is only a sharing of my experiences with some facts to back them up. I'm also going to limit myself to talk about 3 conditions that I have experienced, acknowledging, of course, that the list is not exhaustive. So the first, Honduras is a desperately impoverished nation, second last only to Haiti, with 1 out of 5 Hondurans in rural areas living on less than $2 a day, according to the World Bank. The land reform that was supposed to happen years ago never materialized, and people were never given ownership to the land on which they and their ancestors lived for generations. I remember seeing people squatting on the sidewalk outside the American embassy in Tegucigalpa, the capital, after having been dispossessed by their land overnight. Big agricultural corporations, American and others, confiscate land for oil palm plantation and are destroying untouched nature and peasant agriculture. Corruption was and remained so rampant and widespread The people had no hope to ever being given the possibility to regain possession of their land. No hope, but to live with a great desire to survive and start again in a safer place. A visit in another delegation is impressed in my heart. In my last trip, we went to a village flooded by Hurricane Ian the previous September. There were still piles of mud on the streets that had been removed from the houses. It was so difficult to walk. We hung on to each other, helping each other not to fall in the mud. This was a flourishing village, a major banana producing area, but it all ended in 1998 when a disease affected the crop. I will never forget the place and the conditions in which the people were living, with no hope for help, and this months after the hurricane. The people were so welcoming though, and so grateful for our visit. They felt abandoned by their government. My heart went out to them, really. I will never forget that place. Second, according to the United Nations, approximately 30% of the population in Honduras lacks access to safe drinking water. And many people rely on unsafe sources of water, such as contaminated rivers and wells. I remember my visit to Guapinol, a village located in the valley of Bajo Aguan in the northern of Honduras. The population of the Bajo Aguan Valley has long suffered due to land and water conflicts, leaving over 150 people dead or dispossessed. It is really a beautiful part of the country with mountains, forests, and pristine rivers. It has been designated as a national park. For the residents of Guapinol and surrounding valley, the rivers are an essential part of life and their principal source of drinking water and food. In 2014, the state of Honduras gave a mining concession in the national park to an Honduran company. And this was done without taking into consideration the effect the mining activities and the contamination of rivers will have on the people that rely on them. People are determined to fight to save their rivers. We as a delegation waded in the rivers and performed a blessing of the waters with the local activists, while military watched us from the other bank. I saw poverty, people living in shacks. The only brick houses, either finished or half-built, were the ones of those who had relatives in the United States and sent money home. People lived to find a job in the US, hoping to send enough money to buy the house and to support their family left behind. With the land gone and the water threatened, there is not much possibility for survival. With water, there is life. Without it, we die. These are the words of Reynaldo Dominguez, who lost 2 brothers in the fight, and now in real danger of being assassinated himself. The third reason, crime remains high in Honduras, helping fuel enormous continued flow of northward migration. Gang violence is often linked to the crime of extortion. In Honduras, as in neighborhood Salvador and Guatemala, gang leaders often make extortions call from prison, using members on the outside to collect so-called war tax from individuals, households, and businesses. Young recruits can serve as bagmen and enforcers, threatening, killing, and destroying businesses of those who fail to pay, and battling rivals who encroach in their criminal territory. Parents are afraid for their children. They do not want them to be recruited by the gang because they cannot pay, and so make the difficult choice to run away sometime at night and with very little planning and belongings, and also accepting that their young sons and daughters run away alone to save themselves. And for this is the miners at the borders. We visited Rivera Hernandez, the most violent place in San Pedro Sula, and it is believed in Honduras. In the midst of real city poverty, squalor, and violence, the Sisters of Mercy are sponsoring Paso a Paso, a program for youth to keep them out of the streets, especially those who cannot go to school because they are too poor, hoping of preventing them from joining the gangs. I saw so much joy in those kids. What a safe haven in the midst of so much violence and misery.
So
As
Maria,
I said, yes.
I just want to thank you so much for your firsthand experience and for sharing that with us today. I want to thank you for accompanying the people of Honduras and El Salvador, because what you shared with us helps us better understand that fear and hopelessness that drives people to flee the home that they love. And it makes it easier for us to see, I think, how desperate people become vulnerable to human traffickers. So thank you for joining us. Thank you even more for your experience of accompanying the people of Honduras and El Salvador. So next I need to turn to Marilyn. Marilyn, my friend, I understand that there's some legislation in the pipeline that might just help to break the link between forced migration and human trafficking. I know you've been closely following the developments around HR 5856, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act. I'm wondering if you could briefly describe the scope of the bill and then address the provisions that expand the human trafficking prevention efforts abroad.
Thank you, Anne. I'm happy to do that this morning. This is a very important bill, partly because it is bipartisan. Currently, there are 19 co-sponsors, 10 of which are Republican and 9 of which are Democrat. And it is an important piece of legislation because it was authored by Chris Smith, who is from New Jersey, with Representative Susan Wild from Pennsylvania. And it was also introduced with Michael McCall. And it's important to understand what this bill is doing in terms of the legal framework that we have for trafficking overall. And if passed, this legislation would actually amend the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Many of you will recall that that is the foundational law that was enacted in 2000 that was originally passed to give federal agencies tools and additional methods to combat human trafficking. The way that that law was structured is it is not put on the books and in effect. 100% of the time. It needs to be what we call reauthorized from time to time. So this bill would actually do that. It's also a bill that's organized into several different parts. The first part of it discusses ways to combat human trafficking within the United States. A second part of the bill talks about fighting trafficking abroad. And then it, of course, has appropriations, which for our purposes just means funding for all of these different activities. We don't have time today to go through a very detailed analysis of every single provision in this bill. So what I'd like to do is focus very specifically on the connection between the root causes for forced migration and how this bill is attempting at getting at combating human trafficking. Now, we've heard testimony from Kwami and from Maria, which really gives us a very personal level of experience in terms of why people are fleeing their countries. And what this bill attempts to do is to focus on what we call the root causes to really break the link between forced migration and trafficking. And one way that they attempt to do that is to really expand prevention efforts at the federal agency that's known as the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's commonly called the USAID. And to counter trafficking, what they're trying to do is focus more on in-home countries, economic development, education, food security, and humanitarian assistance. They have a number of corporate development strategies laid out in the bill with the goal to ensure that there would be no increase in trafficking and requiring federal agencies to really integrate protections into their programs. Essentially, what this means is that money would be provided to these countries and standards would be put in place to make sure that there are certain metrics or provisions that are met conditioned upon the funding. The goal, of course, is to prevent migration. And I want to specifically point out that there is set-aside funding. In order to make any of this happen, there needs to be money allocated for this effort. And this bill would set aside funding, $2 million per year for USAID, and that's specific to the activities within the Northern Triangle. A bit of good news, this bill is scheduled to be on the floor this week. So our timing, Ann, I think is important in terms of this legislation. And I know Katie and Fran are going to talk in a bit about how people can get involved in terms of the legislation. But I think that in terms of the floor activity and what we're going to see in the House this week, I think that's something that we need to continue to watch and we'll keep you informed about. I also think this is an important bill because in terms of the overall authorization, as I've mentioned, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, this is really a three-pronged approach at getting at not only trafficking within the United States, but really getting at what's happening within the home countries of people so that they will not migrate. If this bill is put into effect and the money flows and it's successful, then people would be they would have less cause and less reason to leave their home country. I mean, no one wants to abandon their home. No one wants to give up their culture and their way of living simply to come with the hope of potentially getting a job or potentially getting a new life, which is a very treacherous journey, as Kwami and Maria have explained. So with that, Ann, I think I'll stop and we're happy to take questions later about the legislation. But unless you have anything for me now, that's sort of my overview of where the bill stands.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. That's really helpful, both in terms of what's in the bill, at least in broad strokes, and how it will address the conditions that force people to migrate and therefore makes them vulnerable to human trafficking. Thanks too for the hint at what the timeline might be with Congress. Of course, we never know for certain, but at least we've got an idea. So thank you again, Marilyn. And thanks for being willing to step in on short notice to provide us with that summary. Appreciate it. Now I want to call on the executive directors of the two sponsoring organizations. Fran Esken-Royer is the executive director of the National Advocacy Center of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, and Katie Bolander-Goswitch is the executive director of the Alliance to End Human Trafficking. So first, thank you both for your leadership on this issue and for your willingness to be with us today. I want to ask just two quick questions. First, why are your two organizations supporting this particular piece of legislation? And how can our viewers join you in this venture? So Fran, let me ask you to address that first, and then we'll go to Katie.
Sure. First off, I just want to convey Katie and my thanks again to the panelists for what they've shared during this webinar today, and to you, Sister Ann, for moderating. I'll begin by telling our attendees a bit about NAC. The National Advocacy Center of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd lifts up the advocacy priorities of both the sisters in the U.S. and our Good Shepherd social service agencies across the country. And more pointedly, we seek to support those the agencies serve, those on the margins, particularly women and girls. As a result, NAC's advocacy portfolio is rather broad. We focus primarily on issues of poverty, immigration, domestic violence, racial justice, and human trafficking. You may not know much about the congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd, better known as the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, but it's an international religious order of women that has a seat at the UN and a worldwide reputation for supporting survivors of human trafficking. In fact, in the course of this project, we've spoken with Good Shepherd sisters in many different programs across the world assisting survivors to get their insights. So the TVPRA is legislation that NAC has supported since its inception, as Marilyn said, since Congressman Smith authored it in 2000. But what also draws NAC to the legislation is that it's supported by representatives on both sides of the aisle, again, as Marilyn pointed out. NAC strives to demonstrate its nonpartisanship and appreciates that this legislation is an opportunity for Congress to demonstrate its bipartisanship. I also want to acknowledge that though our office is not familiar with all congressional committees, we're very impressed by the bipartisanship of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations. That's the subcommittee that's responsible for this legislation. So I'll stop here and invite Katie to share about the Alliance's connection to the legislation and how we, together with other experts, identified it as one of the 3 pieces of legislation that we're promoting as solutions to break the link between human trafficking and forced migration. Katie?
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Sister Ann. Thank you, Kwami and Sister Maria and Marilyn. Your expertise has been incredibly I think, eye-opening and helpful and uplifting for the work that we do. The Alliance to End Human Trafficking is a collaborative, faith-based national network that offers education with an eye toward prevention and awareness, supports access to survivor services, and engages in advocacy, all in an effort to eradicate human trafficking. Essentially, we envision a world without human trafficking, having a network of services and resources to inform the public, prevent the crime, and assist survivors to achieve a fulfilling life. With an eye toward this project, the Alliance is exceptionally dedicated to addressing root causes of human trafficking. And when we look at human trafficking in the United States, we know that between 70 and 80% of people who are known trafficking victims, and I use that in a legal sense, not to be offensive to survivors, but people who come into contact with law enforcement and are therefore given a legal sort of definition around that. They are all involved in the immigration system in some way, shape, or form. So between 70 and 80% of those known trafficking victims are in some way part of the immigration system. So we looked at that and we said, this is a root cause, forced migration, that perhaps we can do something about. And so we looked at, we did a large webinar last summer. We did a very deep dive into the various policy and legislative solutions that we're currently in the works, and we came up with the 3 that we're working on. And this first one is exceptionally timely in that one, it's going to go to the floor in the House this week, but it is also on February 20th, the anniversary of the death of Frederick Douglass. So in honor of Frederick Douglass, for whom this legislation is named, we are exceptionally hopeful that that this passes the House, moves on to the Senate, and really gets that overwhelming bipartisan support. We know that this bill considers factors that force migrants to leave their homes, and it works to address those so migrants don't have to make the very perilous journey to the United States and find themselves vulnerable to trafficking. So the big question is, what can we do to take action? As we've mentioned, and I've said a couple of times, this bill is going to the House this week, to the floor. So we are going to send you probably either in the chat at some point or in an email today, or both, an action alert, which will send you, click on the little link and it will send you to the website. You'll put in your address. It will send the appropriate message to your representative. We really urge you to ask them to vote for the bill when it comes up this week, hopefully. And we also ask that you call. So click and call. Fran, is there anything else you wanted to add to that call to action?
No, I think you covered it beautifully. The link, actually, when you click on it, it brings you right to the action alert, and then you'll notice at the top there's a phone icon, and if you click on that, once you've put in your information, it'll give you both the name and phone number and a script for you for the phone call. So we really would love for you all to participate. This couldn't be more timely, and so we can really make a difference.
And it looks like the link is in the chat now, so everybody should be able to see that.
And it will be sent later today as well.
Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you both. So there's already action that we can take today to support this legislation and help to begin to break that link between forced migration and human trafficking. So thank you so much for that. So finally, let's turn to the audience and see if we have any questions for the panelists, or perhaps for the executive directors of our 2 sponsoring organizations. So with that, let me begin with a question that's about the legislation. So Fran and Katie, we may need you to come back in. Marilyn, this may be directed at you as well, or any of the other panelists. So anybody who wants to can try this one. There's good bipartisan support in Congress for the goal of ending human trafficking. How can we harness that goodwill to ensure that it encompasses those vulnerable to human trafficking because they're forced to flee their homes? How do we broaden this notion of support for ending human trafficking to include those made vulnerable by forced migration? So if the panelists or the executive directors, anybody want to start with that one?
And I'm happy to take that one.
Thanks, Marilyn.
I think one of the key components when you're speaking with any legislator or their staff has to do with the fact that you've got to begin with education. You can't assume that they even understand much about human trafficking and how it's occurring, because they've got a whole different set of issues that they're facing on a day-to-day basis. And it's really our job to make sure that we can get that information to them so that they can understand how they can take action and help what I call be a voice for the voiceless. I think the other thing that we're focused on from an advocacy perspective is really highlighting the voices of U.S. Catholic sisters in terms of congressional activity and what our experiences are and what our recommendations are for any legislation or public policy. And we've got an advocacy work group who is focused on that. We've got a whole team focused specifically on human trafficking and forced migration. And so to the extent you want to engage with us on any of that, certainly let us know, reach out, and we'd be happy to plug you into any of those activities. So let me stop, Ann, and see if Fran or Katie or anyone else wants to add on to that.
I could just build on what Marilyn has been saying. You know, I think the sisters and also other like-minded folks, we're talking about the dignity of the human person. So whether it's an immigrant or a non-immigrant, anyone who is trafficked deserves to be freed of that. So I think concentrating on our common humanity is a way to sort of just communicate that to the legislators.
Thank you. Thank you. A little bit of a follow-up on that question. One of our listeners asks, do we know which countries particularly would be eligible or might benefit from this appropriations? Are there targeted countries? Anybody
Yeah,
know?
I'll speak very generally to that, and there is a specific allocation for the Northern Triangle, but it also ties in with, for those who are familiar with the Trafficking in Persons report, there are a variety of tiers as to whether or not a country is compliant and where they fall in terms of that scheme. So depending upon which country we're talking about, it's going to depend on their trafficking activity and what they're doing to combat that, which then ties into their allocation in terms of the funding. So it's a little bit of a complex question, but at a high level, that's my answer to it.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. That helps. That helps. And the Northern Triangle would be those countries: Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, particularly. Yes. Yeah. So maybe this question to Maria follows from that a little bit. Maria, there's a question to you about what types of products or companies are produced in the areas where people are being displaced, or what kind of mining is happening in the area that you visited?
Well, I am not sure exactly what kind of mine, what they are mining from the Bago Hagwan, what kind of minerals. I'm sure that they're mining some kind of minerals, but I know that the companies that are in Honduras right now, some of the companies anyway, like the oil palm producers, are destroying the country, as I said, because of the way the soil is with the product or the plant. The plant uses a lot of water anyway. And the other thing is the main crop of especially Honduras was bananas. So and lately, actually, as I said, in 10 years ago, so there was a big virus that killed all the bananas, and so put that with the poverty and the exploitation of the land, you know, that is not allowing people not even to live. You know, and also don't forget that the plantations, like the oil palm plantation, takes away land for planting crops like maize and bananas or any other product that people can eat. So everything that the companies go in for profit, and usually it is something that they take out of the country, not necessarily that is left in the country for the people to live or to sell themselves, you know. And oil company, I mean, the big companies that are there, you know, the profit goes outside. It doesn't remain within the country. And that's the difficulty, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that helps a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask a question, and anybody can take this one. We all know about the current animosity toward immigrants, both in the legislature as well as in the country more generally. So given that current feeling about immigrants, is there any hope that a bill like this, or any other that deals directly or indirectly with immigration, will be successful? Anybody want to take a stab at whether or not we can change the narrative about immigration and get the get this particular piece of legislation, HR 5658?
5856.
5856.
Yes, I can answer at least my perspective, that I do think there is hope with this legislation. One of the nice things about anti-trafficking legislation is it's extremely hard to be against it. To have to answer that to your constituents is a little awkward. Also, I think, looking at this legislation, this piece in particular, looking at the international provisions, you see that those provisions are really to help people stay in their home countries. And I think that will be, that's appealing to both sides of the aisle, and also, and in my heart, probably the most important, to the people themselves who don't want to leave their homes. They leave their homes because of conflict or natural disasters. In Kwami's case, just the opportunity for education and a better life, because those are things that they don't have. If we can help those countries get those things, then I think, we're making a good progress. I did note that there were some questions about how we can ensure some of those resources are getting to the places that they need to go, which I don't know that I can answer. I don't know if anybody else can, if there's any sort of stipulations as to how this will be managed or who will manage it in country. But that is my take on its possibility for passage.
Yep, it's a nice angle and a good suggestion that we can use in our talking points with our members of Congress. Let me turn to Kwami for just a second and ask a kind of related question. Kwami, you're a member of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking of the State Department. What kinds of administrative, executive actions might help to address this link between forced migration and human trafficking?
That's a good question. As I was serving on the advisory council, one of the things that we advise Congress on, because we are required to write a report every year. That's one of our recommendations. So one of the things I specifically fight for was to help with when it comes to the custom, the border custom, or coming through the security system, because before you come here, you have to go through a very intense interviews at the border, at the embassies, and for some other reason, I feel like the question that we're asking aren't geared toward finding if it is a potential traffic will be happening here. So something I was fighting for is that can we kind of have some questions in place in those, that when they are doing interview with some of these people who are seeking to come into the US, is there any way we can put some question in there to see if there's some sort of a red line, is some red tape questions that can maybe jump out if you ask, to see if there's a way to identify right away, is this going to be a situation where this person is being taken advantage of? So something I fought for when I was a part of the council is that, and that was one of my recommendation to the Congress, is that let's take some action on this. Let's try to revise some of the questions or interview questions that we are asking when we are at the embassy, so that we can at least prevent this before it happens. This is very crucial because we have to prevent it. And that's what we talk about in this movement, prevention, right? So if we can start from somewhere, then we can at least slowly to see, okay, so you can prevent it early on, then we won't have a problem on. So, and I think that's something that I think I would love to see that happen, but I know, again, like you said, it's the government, things are slow, but I do have hope that we are getting there slowly with this new bill coming out. I think that might help a lot too, to see that, we can start to prevent some of these things so we can stay home, because I would love to stay home. This is not my choice it's not my choice. I just chose, it's fortunate that I ended up here. But if I had to do it over again, I would definitely stay home. I would definitely stay home because that's where I was born and that's where I belong. That's where God placed me at. So, but also I'm happy to be here as well too. Things happen for a reason, so I'm blessed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. There's so many things that force people to migrate. or make them vulnerable to human traffickers who will bring them to the United States for purposes of trafficking. And your notion of doing some better screening at U.S. embassies abroad to ensure that visas are not given out to folks who are engaged in trafficking, and doing that same thing again at the point of entry into the United States, asking better questions, training those officers to do that initial screening for human trafficking. Yeah, great ideas, great ideas. Well, my friends, I'm afraid our time is getting away from us. It's been a pleasure to join you this morning. I thank you, each and every one of you, for your time. A special thanks to our panelists. Thank you for sharing your hearts with us. Thank you for sharing your lives with us. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. Let me remind you that this is the first in a series of 3 webinars. Over the next weeks, we'll be examining 2 additional pieces of legislation that address the realities that make migrants particularly vulnerable to the evil of human trafficking. So look for an email from us, which will include a link to today's broadcast, information about how you can take action immediately, invitation to contact your representatives and urge them to support HR 5856, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act. And you'll receive from us in the next few weeks an invitation to join us for our second webinar, Breaking the Link, How Immigration Courts Can Protect Vulnerable Children from Trafficking. That's March 4th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And then our third webinar is planned for early April. It will be about work as a solution to prevent human trafficking. So going forward, we promise to keep you abreast of developments and hope that you will join us in our efforts to put an end to human trafficking by addressing its root causes, including forced migration. Thank you again for your time and your continued interest. Blessings on the rest of your day. Thanks.